These are the oldest stories, online at oldeststories.net. Most textbooks and scholarly papers portray the reign of Adad-Nirari III as a period of decline between the early and the late Neo-Assyrian conquests. Now, until recently, I just assumed that this was right, and I held the same view, assuming an 80-year downturn after Shalmaneser until Tiglath-Pileser's revival. However, as I went in and researched it, I found that I think this narrative might be mistaken. Even scholars highlighting specific vibrancy in this era often assume decline elsewhere, and then they end up misrepresenting everything that's outside of their focus, because there's a lot of different papers that do highlight, oh, here's a good thing about this era, but of course we just assume everything else is miserable in this period. For instance, the very best dissertation on Adad-Nirari overlooks Babylon's destruction during Shamshi-Adad's campaign, while studies on Babylon's fall during this period largely assume that Assyria has declined. And this episode here, I want you to know going in, I am challenging scholarly consensus, which is a dangerous thing for a non-expert to do in a field full of actual experts. So do take all of this with a grain of salt, and feel free to blast away down in the comments. Anyway, the starting point in this story, which is the thing that'll color all the rest of Assyrian history for the next 65 years, is that when Shamshi-Adad dies in 811 BCE, Adad-Nirari is still a child, likely 13 years old or less. And this is actually unprecedented in Assyrian history. Other kingdoms, the Egyptians or the Chinese, for example, sometimes do have child kings with regency. But Assyria has never had such a thing, and the wider Near East has seen it only very rarely. And we have no idea why this is the case. We almost never hear about the uncrowned sons of Assyrian kings, so we can't really know if there were or were not eligible brothers that could have taken the throne. But generally it just speaks to a very high level of competition for pretty much every kingship in the Mesopotamian region, for there to have not been these child kings until now. Now, this is the second irregular transition in as many reigns, and while by itself that isn't definitive, and the empire probably could have survived this, but it is an erosion of norms, with consequences that will play out through the rest of Assyrian history. Every time there's a transition that isn't proper, traditional, ordered, it opens the door for more non-traditional, disordered changes of power. Well, where the early period had all those fairly regular father-to-son transitions, we're going in history to start seeing more frequent brother-to-brother transitions, and then outright usurpations, since the dignity of the transition period is now far weaker than it had been previously. But of course, the more direct impact is that for the first time in a very long time, the king of Assyria is not the absolute monarch that he once was. The many smaller governors who had participated in the revolt a decade earlier had often only recently been brought on side, and it's very much an open question of which governor and noble will actively support the king when at least some of the office's former grandeur has diminished. It's not just an ideological question, though, as securing the loyalty of an increasing number of important men who are required to govern a vastly expanded kingdom is a very pragmatic problem as well. And the roots of the solution may have been laid as early as Ashurnasirpal or as late as, later on in Adad-Nirari's reign. I would see it as becoming policy in reaction to the civil war of the previous decades, and the first moves being made probably by the Turtan in Shamshi-Adad's administration, but with the king himself being seemingly focused on little but his own desire for military vengeance. I'm not sure if Shamshi-Adad did very much to advance this practical governmental reform. Adad-Nirari, however, is going to change things up, and that change is going to be focused around the magnates. Now, the first thing for these magnates is to change their terms of service. We don't know, again, exactly when these terms changed, but from now on, any territory that a governor conquers is going to be added to their province. And there do seem to be constraints on this. It's not just a blank check. We don't see a huge rush of governors snapping up every borderland and tiny province, nor do we see evidence of a few dozen raiding armies just bursting forth from the Assyrian provinces for the personal enrichment of the governors. But for all that we're pretty sure it wasn't just this blank check, we don't actually know what the constraints are. The effect, however, is both to increase the sense of investment among the governors of their territory and to strengthen the borders by beginning the process of systematized border defenses, which is a process that'll come to full flower with the reforms of Tiglath-Pileser III. Now, we're not actually there yet. I know some of you are anticipating good old Tiglath-Pileser, so I should add something here. Tiglath-Pileser is famous, among other things, for initiating a pretty sweeping reform of both government and military that ushered in the late Neo-Assyrian period's great heights. We will be discussing these reforms, but something to note is that recent scholarship is making it increasingly clear that many of these reforms have their roots earlier than Tiglath-Pileser. And most commonly, it seems that many of them arise during the period of Adad-Nirari. And many think that Adad-Nirari is acting in response to the civil war of 827-820 that had so tarnished his father's reign. And this is part of why this period is so underrated. People don't realize how significant Adad-Nirari was, nor how important his decisions and the decisions made in nearby states at this time would prove to be. Anyway, the second thing that Adad-Nirari does about the governors is to consolidate many of them. Where traditionally we believe that one governor oversaw one province, the example of Dayan Asher, who seems to have governed a large amount of the Khabur Triangle and was basically the only loyal voice when Ashur-Dan Apli revolted, possibly saving the whole line of succession that Adad-Nirari is descended from. Well, I mean, the lesson drawn from that may have been that having a single loyal voice can be far more valuable than many disloyal voices. And like many reforms, this was an incremental thing, as Shamshi-Adad had also appointed his second Turtan, the one which he controlled, not the one who controlled him, to not only be Turtan over the government and governor over a few different provinces, but also, it seems, master over the royal roads, where he did at least some amount of reconstruction efforts to improve nationwide logistics. In essence, this second Turtan, who was Bel-Lu-Balat, was in charge of a huge amount of just the internal logistical work and construction during his era, while Shamshi-Adad was free to do whatever he wanted, which was mostly obsess over bloody vengeance. While the specifics are often hard to see, it seems that Adad-Nirari will be doing something like this, which will play into the rise of the magnate class during his reign. But the real power in the first few years of Adad-Nirari's reign was not Adad-Nirari himself. He was, remember, much too young. His mother, Shammu-Ramat, ruled in conjunction with the magnate class in general. His Turtan was Nergal-Eliah, promoted from governor of Isana, which is the general area between Ashur and Nineveh along the Tigris, and so a wealthy, important insider gets brought into the palace alongside Shammu-Ramat. Interestingly, even though we've recovered a lot from these various magnates, we haven't actually recovered anything from Nergal-Elijah, though in fact the fact that we have recovered something from his eunuch servant is interesting, both attesting to the broadness of eunuch servitude in the whole upper ranks of the nobility, not just in the royal household, and it suggests that we're missing Nergal-Elijah himself just by accident of preservation, not because he was unusually inactive. Now, most believe that the priority of this regency was in stabilizing an unstable situation left over from Shamshi-Adad. Inner court nobles, who were certainly loyal, were being awarded sizable provincial appointments, and Shammu-Ramat appears to have been a driving force in at least some of those decisions, if not many or most of them. She was personally thanked on a level equal to the king, which I should emphasize, that's not something seen anywhere else in Assyrian texts, by a fellow named Beltarshi-Iluma, who was governor of Kalhu, but then also made lord over a number of other provinces, possibly the area northeast of the heartland. And this is typical of the period. There seems to have been a shortage of administrators. Most likely the shortage is in loyal, reliable administrators, and so those who do pass muster are given not one province, but many, replacing a good number of only questionably loyal subjects. Concentrating all this power in the hands of a very few has obvious risks around their loyalty, but may also be partly responsible for the seeming inactivity of this period. Governors are critical logistical managers, overseeing the distribution of a large number of things, and if their time is taken up with the regular maintenance of multiple provinces, it may be the case that many of them had less time to devote to new grand projects. Anyway, in the 5th or 6th year of Adad-Nirari's reign, and I will say we can't be too specific in any of this because we don't have his surviving annals, although he almost certainly did write some, we just don't have them. It seems that his mother received a request for aid from a certain fellow named Ushpililume of Kumu. Now that name alone is telling. It shows how much the traditional name of Shipililiuma, famous among the Hittites of old, has shifted among these Neo-Hittites. Now, of course, Shipililiuma isn't an easy name in any language, I would think, so it is perhaps unsurprising that the name has shifted over time. Ushpililume has been a loyal vassal, continuing to pay tribute, but over the last 20 years of instability and neglect out in the once conquered areas of Syria, his neighbors are no longer good tribute payers. They have decided that the land of Ashur is no longer able or willing to intervene this far west, and so they're not only refusing to pay tribute, but are now also preying on nations who are relying on Assyrian protection to survive. Remarkably, the very earliest account of this event, written while on campaign, notes that Ushpililume caused Adad-Nirari and his mother to cross the Euphrates. And I'll say that one line has been the subject of more academic writing than probably the entire rest of Adad-Nirari's reign. Usually, no one causes an Assyrian king to do anything, at least not in Assyrian royal propaganda. We assume that the kings were, in practice, sensitive to the needs of diplomacy and their obligations to vassals and so forth, but they certainly never acknowledge it openly. And indeed, later mentions of this campaign present it in a more typical fashion. Once he says that the kings out west had, just become uppity and rebellious, so he went out to put them down, making no mention of obligation there. And in other places he mentions that Adad-Nirari, king of Arpad, had specifically begun to withhold tribute, and this campaign was a punitive expedition in response to that. And just in that sequence, we can see the gradual myth-making that's so often typically unrevealed to us in the official sources. It's quite likely that all three claims are true, but one of them frames the way in a manner far more positive to the king. In the first case, it makes the king look reactive at best. And in the second case, mentioning that a whole bunch of kings had slowly been getting uppity for the last 20 years kind of looks bad for the institution of kingship. What were those previous kings busy doing? Much better to say that, this one guy decided to rebel, and so this was a punitive expedition. It makes it look far more like only a few isolated fools would ever dare to oppose the empire, and all those who do can expect to be personally singled out and crushed. More than this, of course, is the note that Shammu-Ramat crossed the Euphrates alongside Adad-Nirari. Her actual involvement in this campaign is simply unknown. Some suggest that she was nothing but a parasite, boosting her reputation while the menfolk did all the work, while others paint a picture of Shammu-Ramat as a girl boss, fighting the good fight and then handling all the diplomacy after. And the truth is that we have no idea how much Shammu-Ramat was involved in the actual victory, but this is only because we need to remember that we usually don't know how involved the king himself is in these victories, and how much credit is properly due to the king's subordinates. Discussions which forget to acknowledge that can get lost in the speculative weeds very quickly. But whatever the case, it is clear that Shammu-Ramat is presenting herself not as equal to the king, but definitely beside him, in a way which no one else gets to be in normal times. She also has a stela in Kalhu, which is just her name and lineage, but the existence of this slab at all, and her ability to present herself as so closely tied to the king, as well as to Shamshi-Adad and Shalmaneser, is remarkable. But let's not forget about that campaign in Syria, for focusing on all the details of it. Adad-Nirari, his mother, and of course the Assyrian army were able to defend Ushpilulume of Kumu from a coalition of 9 kings led by Arpad. They dispersed the coalition and were able to affix a boundary stone in a disputed area in favor of Kumu, the loyal vassal. So there was a victory here, though not one that saw all the areas of Syria cowed before the destructive might of Ashur. It was still spoken of in glowing terms in the official sources, but given the limited victory and subsequent boundary negotiation, we mostly assume that Shammu-Ramat may have been most involved in the international politics necessary to settle the situation after perhaps the military didn't do quite as much settling as we usually expect them to. And so the most that we can say about this famous queen mother, who never took a formal title higher than palace woman, is that she took an active role in politics, both internal and international, and may have been involved in at least one major military campaign. And then, after about 805, we hear no more from her. The standard assumption is that by this point Adad-Nirari has transitioned fully from a boy to a man, and is by now showing signs of being a king with quite a bit to recommend himself. And so the Queen Mother peacefully retires back to the palace, where she may have remained an advisor and emissary, but never again acted in a way visible to history. The alternative, of course, is that, maybe she just died, either naturally or via court intrigue. But we hear nothing at all about the matter either way. Now, this is an important transition, however, because it happens right between two major campaigns. The 805 campaign against Arpad and its coalition in North Syria seems to have been one of restrained goals and clear but not crushing victory. This could have left the matters out west uncertain, for as Adad-Nirari notes in one inscription, during the reign of his father, the various kingdoms of the west grew strong and withheld tribute. And this does seem to be an understatement. As we'll see in the coming episodes, this period sees a major expansion of neighboring kingdoms, from the birth of Phrygia to the growth of Urartu, to minor neighbors like briefly independent Suhu and the growing western powers. Out east, the Persians are starting to establish themselves in Iran, and even Egypt, though under foreign domination, would do fairly well for themselves in this century under the Libyan pharaohs of the 23rd dynasty. And we shouldn't neglect the fact that, while they're not really part of our story, the Greeks are starting to get their act together, with most historians putting the start of the Archaic period right around Adad-Nirari's reign. And don't forget, the Phoenicians are in a period where their colonial efforts are really maturing. As we can see, to conclude that the prosperity of the small kingdoms of the Near East at this time is due to the weakness of Assyria, as many will claim, that is at best an incomplete picture. Assyria's quietness certainly played a role, but when seeing human development that broadly throughout the region, we're looking at a region-wide increase in climate and trade, which feeds on itself as these larger regional entities are more able to inhibit low-level raiding and warfare, leading to peace among the small villages and concentrations of wealth among the elites, which in turn enable capital investments. These capital investments both raise the cost of war for the elites, because you might lose those capital investments to some pillaging army, and they increase the wealth of the region. And yet for Assyria, this is a dangerous situation. The great kingdom is quiet because its governors recognize the advantages, but the Assyrian Empire, being ruler over many vassals, is reliant on its seeming invincibility. Should other nations grow large enough to challenge it, the whole system might fall apart. Biblically, 2 Kings chapter 13 happens at just this time in history and describes it in the usual way. Usual for the Bible, unusual for us as historians. It is because King Jehoahaz was wicked that God allowed Ben-Hadad, son of Hazael, to become a powerful king over in Damascus. Now, we might recall that Shalmaneser had needed to beat up on the expansionist Hazael, and Ben-Hadad has continued that expansionist tradition at the expense of poor Israel among other neighboring nations. Scripture then says that God sent a savior to Israel, and it's not very clear about the details. Some see Adad-Nirari in beating up Damascus as that savior. And I do want to caution people not to get too caught up in this, as Adad-Nirari was certainly involved in this Israel's salvation, but the text is sufficiently vague that, in my own opinion, it's likely referring to an unnamed local leader, not the king of Israel, but some local leader of some sort who was directly responsible for recovering the land that had been taken by Damascus despite the tiny standing army available to Israel. And the Bible's probably not referring to this foreign king who had set up the circumstances for Israel to take that territory back. But again, that section of the scripture is quite vague, just sort of mentioning events and then saying, hey, look, go check out the book of Chronicles of the king of Israel. That's got all the details for you. And of course, this contemporaneous record has now very much been lost. So we don't have enough to fully discredit Adad-Nirari as the hand of God in this passage. but neither do we have enough to assume that it was him. Rather, it's all context for a period that Scripture skips over quite quickly. Back to Mesopotamia, though, Adad-Nirari was militarily quite hesitant to engage out west, likely due to a shortage of horses. More on that in a bit. But a few years after defeating Arpad, diplomacy and further threat of violence subdue North Syria enough for him to make a ritual procession to the Mediterranean Sea, where he brings back some cedar wood and is able to make the claim of having reached the far edge of the earth. A few years later, he's finally in a position to deal with the unacceptable expansion of Damascus. The capital city is besieged for much of the year, during which time a great deal of devastation is laid on the country, and after which a massive burden of tribute is placed, which is paid for the rest of Adad-Nirari's life, or so it would seem. We aren't sure exactly which year this Damascene campaign occurred in. Estimates range anywhere from 805 to 796. But whatever it was, it would apparently satisfy Adad-Nirari, who would not bother to look west again for the rest of his life. For all that this would seem to be the setup for another looming disaster, even though we don't have another recorded visit by an Assyrian king until 773, which is between 20 and 30 years later, that follow-up visit appears to have Damascus still pacified and tribute paying. And honestly, there's just so much we don't know about the politics of this era, and especially as we sink deeper into the age of the magnates, we know less and less about Assyria itself, while simultaneously getting the idea that more and more minor kingdoms are playing their own roles on the grand political stage. Damascus might have remained loyal out of fear, not of the Assyrian armies, but of the power of their neighbors. And the truth is, we just don't know. Now, talking about Assyrian hesitancy, some of that is military weakness, but it isn't just a general decline in military preparedness. If the military overall was any weaker than in other eras, we just can't see it on the record. What we can see, however, is that right as cavalry is becoming increasingly important, the stocks of horses within the land of Ashur are dwindling. Horses are, in a sense, consumable, which is kind of an unpleasant thing to think about, but they're also not producible through increased effort and manpower. They can only be invested in and allowed to grow in size. Interestingly, though the entire Near East has been rather familiar with the idea of horse breeding and horse rearing for over 800 years at this point, it seems that no major civilized power has ever yet figured out how to do it at scale. Wild horse populations double every 5 years or so in optimal conditions, but the growth rates in ancient stables appear to have been far lower than that for a variety of reasons. This means that for a certain population, it takes a fixed amount of time for it to double, over 5 years probably, though we can't say for sure how long. But consider that royal stables were massively expensive, and so the amount of horses that could be afforded at any one time was limited, meaning that the amount of natural growth per year was also limited. But Iron Age warfare took a heavy toll on horses, meaning that even as a large kingdom, they needed to space out their major battles in order to allow their horse populations to naturally regrow, or they just needed to bring in horses from somewhere else. And of course, the whole not having war thing, that's just not in the cards for the Assyrians, and it simply wasn't possible at this point to just purchase the volume of horses required to replace their annual losses. And this means that they are dependent on tribute from the horse masters of the Armenian and Iranian mountains. Assyria at his strongest, which is in the early Neo-Assyrian period and the late Neo-Assyrian period, follows an infantry paradigm. First, like we saw under Ashurnasirpal, and then the reformed infantry paradigm that we'll see under the Sargonid kings. But right about now, or possibly late in Shalmaneser's reign and then continuing until now, they finally really figured out how to deploy what we would think of as standard cavalry forces. And the power of that cavalry charge really is undeniable. And it seems to have made generals of the era forget just how unstoppable the Assyrian infantry really is. Now, an alternative explanation is perhaps the rise of cavalry in the region has actually been more successful at countering the typical Assyrian infantry tactics in this generation, which causes them to lean more heavily on cavalry as a compensation. No one really knows about this. The point is that Assyria needs horses. Assyria can't seem to maintain their own horses because they can't stop having wars long enough to let them breed back up, and the only place that they can easily get access to horses was just conquered by Urartu. Yeah, about that last bit. We don't have a clear picture of Urartian expansions year by year, but by the middle of Adad-Nirari's reign, those mountainous areas to the north and east that Assyria used to beat on a few times each decade to steal horses from, they've now all been conquered by Urartu. And Adad-Nirari is either eminently sensible or he's a coward, and he never even tries to attack Urartu at this point. Instead, since Urartu has conquered the nearby horse-raising mountain folk, Adad-Nirari is forced to go further and further west, deep into the mountains and even past them, out into the Iranian plateau, the land of the Medes and Persians as they're entering into the region. Now, neither the Medes nor the Persians are a unified people, and being tiny tribes, they're easy pickings for even the exhausted Assyrian armies that make it all the way out there. But aside from horses, there's very little wealth to be gained from these expeditions, especially compared to the cost of getting all the way out there. And this is another factor in Assyrian weakness during this period. It all compounds around horses. You can think of targets in general as being low wealth or high wealth or strategically important, sometimes a mix of two or more of those. And Adad-Nirari is largely unable to target places that are specifically high wealth because he has to spend all his time in low wealth areas in order to gather the horses necessary in order to attack and hold just the strategically necessary areas. We'll see these strategically necessary areas next episode. Thus, the military activity that once brought wealth into the empire is now becoming a resource drain. And as big as the Assyrian Empire already is, we should always think of all ancient governments as being incredibly constrained on resources, at least in terms of large-scale projects like building and campaigning. And this is, I think, the core of truth behind the idea that the Assyrian Empire is weak during this period. This is the military hesitancy that allows neighboring nations to flourish. It isn't climate, as other nations do quite well during this time, nor is it government failure. For all that we focus on the rise of the magnates, they seem to be universally loyal and competent, replacing the noble houses who had been the minor governors prior to Ashur-Danin-Apli's civil war. And while this is a time of weak kings, Adad-Nirari himself doesn't seem to be one of those weak kings. He performs pretty well given the circumstances, even when he appears to be dominated at the start and end of his reign by others. This is not a period of national weakness for Assyria as a whole. But this episode is running a bit long, and so I'm just going to split it here. But we're going to see next time. The governors mostly do quite well for the nation, building up infrastructure, establishing defensive garrisons, and handling their own parts of the empire, while the king spends all his time on the top-level priority matters. In theory, at least, it's actually a pretty good system, and all the better for being really propped up by the competence displayed by the people at the top. But we're going to save all that for next time. This episode is releasing on Christmas, and I don't have any Christmas special for you, but hopefully this rambling meditation on women and horses will make your special day even more special. If you do want more content, remember that I do have a YouTube channel membership and a Patreon. Both of those are now getting exclusive, magical, special Egyptian history and literature episodes that you can go check out. There's 2 right now, a 3rd one coming up soon. So if you feel like checking those out, definitely check them out. And join us next time right here on The Oldest Stories to finally learn what exactly all those magnates were off doing to make this the age of the magnates. And until then, Merry Christmas and Happy New Year. Thank you for listening.